They brought in every top engineer, every AI specialist, and still the Navy's most advanced ship stayed dead in the water until the retired black sailor showed up with nothing but a notebook, a wrench, and 30 years of gut instinct. "Sir, we've lost propulsion again." Lieutenant Neil Darby stood stiff in the control room of the USS Halcyon, his face drained of all color. The words he spoke hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one breathed. Captain Elise Brannon stepped forward, her boots clicking. "On the metal floor? Define again, Lieutenant." Darby's voice dropped. "Main hybrid unit cycled down. Manual restart. Failed. She's not responding to backup protocols either." Silence. Then a low curse from the chief engineer, Bradley Tennyson, who'd been hunched over the diagnostics panel for the past 4 hours. He didn't look up. This was day 2 of what was supposed to be a 5-day classified training exercise. 120 miles off the coast of San Diego, the Halcyon, a nearly $4.3 billion marvel of military engineering, was dead in the water. No forward motion, no power to weapons, limited comms. One of the Navy's most advanced destroyers had turned into a 9,000-ton paperweight. The hybrid propulsion system was meant to be untouchable. Months of secrecy surrounded its installation, and only a handful of engineers had clearance to work. On it, it combined electric turbines, gas propulsion, and an adaptive AI interface that monitored engine health in real time. But now all that brilliance was useless. In the engine room, the tension was tighter than the steel walls. A group of 10 engineers, both Navy and civilian, hovered around diagnostic stations, sweating through their uniforms. Software updates had been pushed, circuit boards replaced, the AI reinitialized twice. Nothing worked. At 0400 hours, Captain Brannon made the call. "Wait, we're not making any more guesses," she said, pacing in the briefing room. "Someone outside this circle needs to look." At this, Commander Raj Patel, head of the engineering division aboard, shook his head. "That won't sit well with command. They handpicked this team for a reason." Brannon met his eyes. "And yet this team hasn't fixed it." She knew how this looked. This ship was one of the Navy's crown jewels. If word got out that it had failed just weeks after deployment, heads would roll. Probably hers first. The higher-ups weren't thrilled, but they approved the request. A silent chain reaction of calls and emails spread up the command ladder. The Navy's top propulsion consultants were contacted one after another. They reviewed the data and declined to intervene. Not enough intel. Too many unknowns.
The risk
to their reputations was too high. By the start of day 3, the morale of the crew was sinking fast. Food rations were fine, but patience was fraying. Petty Officer Lindsay Roy, usually the comic relief of the lower deck, barely spoke during her shift. A sense of failure began to wrap around the ship like a fog. Admiral Clarence Pike received the update at precisely 0815 hours. He sat in his office at Naval Base Point Loma, reading through the latest diagnostics and field reports. He'd been a hard-nosed commander for most of his 37-year career, the kind who spoke little and expected a lot. But even he knew when to admit that something wasn't adding up. "Get me Raymond Ellis," he said, without looking up from the tablet. His assistant paused. "Sir, you heard me? I don't care where he is. Find him." There was a reason Ellis's name hadn't been brought up earlier. The man had been out of the game for nearly 8 years. He'd retired quietly, without ceremony, and hadn't touched a Navy engine since. But Pike remembered a day in Bahrain, when an entire power grid nearly collapsed and Ellis, barely a senior enlisted at the time, rerouted an entire system using just a wrench and a sketchbook. He didn't need AI. He didn't need theory. The man listened to machines. Back on the Halcyon, Captain Brannon stood at the edge of the deck, staring out at a sea that no longer looked peaceful. Then her comm crackled.
"Captain,
Command has greenlit. A consultant, civilian status, coming in under emergency clearance, 8 to 5 hours. She raised an eyebrow. Name, Raymond Ellis. She turned and walked back inside without a word. But 5 hours on a ship that felt like it had given up was longer than anyone wanted to admit. The engines weren't the only thing that had shut down. By the time the third day hit its midpoint, the USS Halcyon felt more like a floating memory than a warship. The air carried the weight of quiet frustration, and no one needed to say it out loud. The ship wasn't just stuck, it was embarrassed. In the mess hall, conversations had dried up. Even the younger sailors, usually quick with sarcasm and jokes, were silent. They moved slower, ate less. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Few pretended they weren't worried. Most didn't bother pretending. Down in the engine room, the smell of burned rubber still lingered from the last emergency reset. The system had blown another fuse overnight, one of the last backup relays. Now the main console sat dark, the onboard. AI looped in diagnostics purgatory, and the best anyone could offer was speculation. "We're missing something fundamental," Commander Raj Patel muttered, crouched next to the power grid access panel. "But I can't figure out what it is. Nothing in the data makes sense." Beside him, civilian contractor Hannah Yuan scrolled through code on her tablet, frowning, looking at this through the lens of perfection. This system was designed in a lab, but ships don't live in labs. Patel leaned back against the wall and sighed. "I know. We need someone who understands chaos." That's when the call came through, an announcement over the internal comms. A civilian consultant was en route under high priority clearance. Arrival scheduled by chopper within the hour. All engine personnel to standby. Most of the crew had no idea what that meant. Some assumed it was another MIT wunderkind with a fresh algorithm. Others joked that maybe the president was sending Elon Musk. Only Captain Brannon and a few senior staff knew the name, Raymond Ellis. He didn't look like anyone had expected when the Black Hawk touched down on the makeshift helipad on deck. Man who stepped off war-worn boots, a faded Navy windbreaker, and a face full of creases carved from time, salt, and diesel fumes. His left hand held a notebook so beaten it looked like it had traveled with him through several wars. Round his neck dangled an ancient stethoscope, navy blue rubber dulled to a murky gray. Chief Tennyson squinted. "This the guy?" Ellis didn't bother responding. He glanced at the crew waiting to greet him and simply said, "Where's the engine room?" They walked in silence, save for the steady rhythm of boots and bulkheads as they descended through the levels. Ellis asked just 3 questions. "What's she running?" "GE Hydrocore hybrid system," Yuan replied. "Last gen code with a semi-autonomous diagnostic shell." "What's she not doing?" "Everything," muttered Patel. Ellis stopped just outside the engine room door and looked around. The hallway felt colder here, even without the chill of the ocean. He tapped the side of the wall twice with his fingers, listening to the faint vibration. He nodded once. "Then don't touch anything until I've heard her." Inside, the crew stood back, unsure whether to feel hope or irritation. A few whispered to each other about how ridiculous it seemed. The old man hadn't brought a laptop. He hadn't asked for data logs or real-time reports. Just stepped up to the dead core and listened. Literally, he bent over slightly, placed the old stethoscope against a junction pipe and stood still. Completely still. His eyes didn't blink. His breath didn't shift. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then nearly a full minute. Nobody knew what to say until Ellis straightened up and asked, "Who adjusted the heat sink capacitors after the shutdown?" A young Navy mechanic raised her hand hesitantly. "Me, sir," following the default sequence. Ellis shook his head. "You followed it wrong. Not your fault. The sequence was designed for clean installs, not for a hot core mid-cycle failure." Looked at Patel. "You ever try resetting a circuit while someone's welding the power line?" Patel blinked. "What?" "You're trying to restart a system that's fighting itself because you're overriding the original failsafe. She's locking you out because she's not broken. She's in defense mode." A long silence. Then Yuan muttered, "I didn't even think that was possible." Ellis scratched something in his notebook. "Most don't. It's not unless you've seen this system in its first form before they put AI on top of it. This machine's not just complex. She's scared." He turned finally and gave the crew a half-smile that looked more tired than amused. "You've been yelling at her?" "I'm just here to speak her language." Captain Brannon arrived, just as the engineers began rewiring under Ellis's guidance. She didn't speak. She watched. watched as a man with no access badge, no degrees hanging on a wall, and no patience for theory took control of a ship to advance for its own designers. But nobody expected what would happen in the next 20 minutes, 7 years earlier. Raymond Ellis had turned in his badge, walked off the USS Grafton without a ceremony, and never looked back. He didn't do retirement speeches, didn't keep up with Navy politics, never once attended a reunion. He spent most of his days in Norfolk, Virginia, at the edge of the shipyard district, working out of a rusted garage that smelled like oil, salt, and burnt coffee. People in the neighborhood brought him old outboard motors, busted pumps, and broken tools with no hope. Somehow, he always made them run. That morning, Ellis had been working on a 1968 Johnson V4 outboard when his phone rang, a landline that barely worked and rarely rang. He wiped his hands, glanced at the caller ID, and muttered, "Too early for recruiters." He answered anyway. They said, "Raymond." Pause. Then, "Chief Ellis, this is Admiral Clarence Pike. You remember me?" Raymond froze for a moment, not out of fear, out of memory. Bahrain, a failing power grid. 2-hour window before blackout. "I remember," he said simply, his voice like sandpaper dragged over truth. "I need you," Pike said. "The Halcyon's down. She's not responding to anyone. Civilian contractors, engineers, AI coders, we've thrown everything at her. Nothing's worked." Raymond didn't answer right away. He looked down at the grease on his hands, rubbed it against a rag, and thought about the ship that once made headlines as the Navy's smartest vessel. A destroyer so advanced even its maintenance protocols were classified. "I've read about her," he finally replied. "She's not just stuck," Pike said. "She's drowning." Ellis leaned against the wall of his garage. "You've got 200 engineers at your disposal? What the hell do you need me for?" Pike's tone shifted, softer, almost vulnerable, because they're all trying to outthink the system. "I need someone who can feel it." Ellis laughed dryly. "What is this? A motivational speech? I'm a mechanic, not a prophet." Pike didn't flinch. "You're the only one who's seen the bones of this system before it got wrapped in AI and algorithms. Before the Navy made it too smart to understand." Another pause. Ellis stared at the notebook sitting on his workbench, the one he hadn't opened in over 3 years, full of engine diagrams, field notes, and problem cycles hand-sketched during long nights at sea. "I don't wear the uniform anymore, Clarence." "Not asking you to. I'm asking you to help us fix a mistake. Mistake we're all too proud to admit we made." Raymond didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He simply hung up. 10 minutes later, he called back. "You got a bird ready?" "Already warming up," Pike said. By the time the helicopter landed on the Halcyon, word had already spread through the upper levels of Naval Command. Some questioned Pike's judgment. Others were curious. A few laughed. An old chief with no clearance. Codes, no digital credentials, no current certifications, was being flown onto a billion-dollar ship to fix a problem that had stumped every expert in the Department of Defense. But Pike didn't care. He remembered the man who once patched an engine blindfolded because the lights had failed during a blackout in the Strait of Hormuz, who once used the sound of engine vibrations to map out a fractured power shaft before it snapped completely. He remembered what Raymond Ellis could do, not because he was gifted, but because he listened harder than anyone else. On board the Halcyon, the skepticism was heavy. Lieutenant Darby was the first to speak when the chopper was heard. "You think this guy's going to be the answer?" Commander Patel gave a weak shrug. "At this point, I'd settle for a janitor with a flashlight if it gets us off this grid." They weren't being sarcastic, just tired. Tired of blinking screens, failed diagnostics, and the creeping feeling that the ship was becoming something they no longer understood. When Raymond Ellis stepped onto the deck, eyes followed him, not out of awe, but curiosity. Who was this man? Carrying nothing but a notebook and an old stethoscope? Captain Brannan met him at the hatch. Her voice was firm but respectful. "Chief Ellis, I've read your file. We appreciate you coming." Ellis looked her square in the eyes. "I didn't come for the Navy. I came for the ship." She blinked. Fair enough. But nobody knew just how personal that statement really was. The garage smelled of gasoline, seawater, and rust. Just how Raymond Ellis liked it. Before the call from Pike, this place had been his entire world. Tucked between a crabbing supply shop and a barely legal auto salvage yard off Granby Street in Norfolk, it wasn't much to look at. It had a tin roof patched with scrap aluminum, no AC, just an old desk fan that coughed more than it blew. But inside was history, engines in various stages of resurrection. A disassembled 1985 Yamaha 150 sat across from an old diesel generator Ellis had bought at auction for $20. One wall was lined with tools. Another held stacks of yellowing Navy maintenance manuals dating back to the 70s. Above the workbench hung a black and white photo of Raymond and his late wife Jeanette, taken on a pier in San Diego after his final overseas deployment. He hadn't been on a ship since Jeanette passed. That was the deal he made with himself. More engines he couldn't carry in both hands. No more systems with names longer than the boats they powered. But when Pike called, something inside shifted. Not pride, not nostalgia, something deeper, something that had been buried under layers of grief, oil, and silence. That night, before boarding the military transport that would fly him out to the USS Halcyon, Ellis sat alone on the back steps of the garage, a cup of cold black coffee in hand. The streets around him were quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask questions. He opened the notebook. The first page was dated September 14th, 1989. Scribbled diagrams, power curves, notes about turbine surges and cooling flow corrections. Every page after that told a story most men couldn't begin to decode. But to Ellis, it was muscle memory-like. Reading an old journal written in the hum of steel and fire, at 2 a.m., a black SUV pulled up outside. The driver was a young petty officer who looked like he hadn't been born when Ellis retired. Stepped out of the vehicle, squared his shoulders, and offered a crisp salute. "Chief Ellis, sir. You're a transport to Oceana Air Base." Raymond gave him a nod-no salute, just a handshake. Firm, grounded, real. "I'll be a minute." Inside the garage, Ellis grabbed three things: the notebook, the stethoscope, and a small battered wrench wrapped in cloth. The wrench had belonged to his father, a shipbuilder at the old Newport News Yard. Ellis hadn't used it in years, but he packed it like a man taking an heirloom into battle. As they drove toward the base, the young driver glanced at him. "If you don't mind me asking, Chief, why'd they call you?" Raymond didn't smile. "Because I used to talk to machines before they learned how to talk back." The kid didn't get it. That was fine. He didn't need to by sunrise. Raymond was on a Navy-issue transport jet heading west at 500 knots. Alone in a row of jump seats, he watched the coastline shift beneath him. Carolina, then Georgia, then the stretch of Gulf that reminded him of too many missions that went sideways before they started. He closed his eyes for a moment. And he was back. Back inside the USS Tremont, 2002. Electrical fire mid-patrol. The power grid hemorrhaging. He remembered climbing into a space so tight he dislocated his shoulder just to reach a junction. Fixed it blind, came out with burns. He didn't bother reporting. It wasn't about heroics. It was about responsibility. When you're the last line between the crew and the dark, you move. And now here he was again, touching down at Naval Base Point. Loma, he barely spoke a word during intake. No one gave him trouble. He came with Pike's name and Pike's authority. That was enough. At the edge of the helipad, an officer handed him a file. "This is the system blueprint." "Wait. I'll meet her myself." He stepped onto the helicopter with the same calm you'd expect from someone boarding a bus to work. But inside, something flickered. Not nerves, not doubt focus. Pure, practiced, surgical focus. As the chopper lifted, Raymond leaned back, closed his eyes, and said to himself, "I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to listen." But the Halcyon wasn't just broken. She was hiding something no one had seen coming. The helicopter landed hard to hard. The wind kicked up sheets of salt water over the deck as the rotors screamed against the ocean air. Crew members stood at a distance, eyes squinting, arms crossed. No one looked excited. Most just looked tired. Raymond Ellis stepped out without hesitation. He wore the same clothes he'd flown in with. Dark denim, steel-toe boots, and that battered Navy windbreaker that had seen at least 2 different oceans. Round his neck, that old stethoscope swung slightly in the wind. In one hand, he held the notebook. In the other, a small cloth bundle, the wrench. The sailors didn't salute. They weren't sure if they should. He didn't look like a man the Navy would send. Lieutenant Neil Darby stood at the edge of the landing pad, barely concealing his doubt. "Sir, we've been expecting—" "Don't sir me," Raymond cut him off, calm but sharp. "I'm not in uniform, and I'm not here to impress anybody." Darby blinked, nodded once, then stepped aside. Captain Elise Brannon came forward next. She had a reputation for being clear, efficient, and brutally honest, qualities that got her command faster than most. She extended her hand. "Chief Ellis, welcome aboard." Raymond shook it, firm but not showy. "I'm not here to give speeches," he said. "Just show me where the girl's sleeping." Brannon raised an eyebrow at his phrasing. "Follow me." The corridors of the Halcyon were spotless to the art, wiring, fresh stainless steel, modern lighting. But Raymond didn't look at any of that. Kept his eyes slightly unfocused, ears tuned like a man listening for a tune everyone else had forgotten. "Feels too quiet," he muttered. Captain Brannon glanced sideways. "We shut most systems to preserve backup power. Not that kind of quiet. I mean the kind where something's wrong and doesn't want to say it out loud." She didn't respond, just walked faster. When they reached the engine room, Ellis stopped at the threshold. 10 engineers were inside, some civilian, some Navy, standing in a semicircle around the silent hybrid core. A few glanced up, clearly skeptical. One of them, a tall civilian, in a clean tech vest, leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "They sent us the janitor." Raymond caught it, didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, set his notebook on a nearby ledge, and walked up to the dead machine. It was massive, 20 feet of sealed turbines, dual generators, and more wires than a NASA launch. The digital readouts were blank, the AI interface was offline, and every inch of it looked too new to touch. "Where was the last pulse?" Ellis asked, turning to Commander Raj Patel. Patel blinked. "What?" "Last pulse. The last time she tried to start where was the failure path." Patel cleared his throat, pulling out a tablet. Sector B7. Voltage collapsed during reinitialization." Raymond moved slowly, like he was walking through a memory. He tapped the outer casing with the handle of his wrench, listened, then moved 5 steps to the left, bent down and placed his stethoscope on a junction node. The engineers exchanged glances. A few smirked. One even chuckled under his breath. Raymond didn't care. He stayed there, crouched for nearly 30 seconds. Eyes closed, breathing even. Then he stood up, turned around, and pointed at a row of components near the cooling relay. "That's the wrong capacitor type." The room went still. Hannah Yuen, the civilian systems tech, stepped forward. "That's impossible." He double-checked it against the design specs. "You checked what the computer told you to check," Ellis replied, "but not what the ship was built with. That relay model was switched out during prototype testing. It creates a voltage echo when paired with the core interface. Can't be read by the AI because the algorithm doesn't know what it's looking at." Patel frowned. That was never in the manual. Raymond walked over and peeled back the side panel, revealing a small, charred piece of metal. Because the manual was written after the system got sanitized for production. "I saw this exact failure once in 2008 on a test platform. They buried it." Now the smirks faded. Captain Brannon folded her arms. "Can it be fixed?" Raymond looked at her. "You got solder and a part we can cannibalize from the comm relay housing?" She hesitated. "That's not regulation." Raymond tilted his head. "Neither is being dead in the water for 4 days." She nodded once. "Do it." But as the engineers scrambled to follow his lead, no one realized how close they'd already come to a total systems collapse. Raymond didn't work fast, he worked right. The other engineers, used to rushing under pressure, hovered impatiently. As he sat cross-legged on the floor, laying out tools from a small canvas pouch, his hands moved with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades listening to machines in distress. Pull the relay from comms housing, he said to a young technician. But don't touch the shielding. It's brittle. You break it, it's useless. Kid Petty Officer D'Angelo Morris nodded more carefully this time. Yes, sir. Not sir. Just Raymond. Morris smiled faintly, disappearing around the corner. Commander Patel paced nearby, arms crossed. So you really think one outdated capacitor is the whole issue? Raymond looked up. No. I think it's where the problem started. The rest is just everything else reacting to bad information. He grabbed the old capacitor, still warm from being overworked, and placed it next to the new one. They were nearly identical, same size, same shell, but inside, a world of difference. This is what I've been saying for 2 days, Hannah Yuan muttered. This system isn't failing, it's rejecting something. Exactly, Raymond said. She's trying to protect herself. Every time you restart her, you're making her think she's under attack. Captain Brannon had joined them again, arms behind her back, silent but focused. Raymond continued. The AI in these newer systems, it doesn't just obey, it evaluates. If something doesn't make sense, it shuts down as a defensive response. Logic tree's gonna fix that. You gotta fix the logic it thinks is real. Morris returned with the salvaged part, holding it like it was a raw egg. Raymond nodded. Perfect. Took the replacement, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. No gloves, no diagrams, just a man and a machine talking in a language only they understood. Wires were clipped, contacts cleaned. The soldering iron hissed as the metal melted into place. The smell hit a sharp electric temps that made everyone in the room pause. It was the smell of repair, of risk, of one last shot. When he finished, Raymond leaned back and wiped his hands on a rag. All right, he said. Cycle the primary. Don't push it. Let her come back on her own. Commander Patel took a breath. Restarting system now. The lights flickered. Low vibration rolled through the floor like distant thunder. Then nothing. Everyone stared. Raymond didn't react. He stepped forward, pressed the stethoscope to the main coil casing, and listened. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then a low click echoed from the panel. The diagnostic screen lit up dim at first. Then stable, then bright. Core temperature stabilizing, said Hannah, eyes locked on her tablet. Auxiliary relays responding, added Patel. Propulsion interface online, Maurice said, his voice climbing with hope. The entire engine room stood still, afraid to speak too loud like they might scare it back into silence. Captain Brannon broke the moment. Mr. Ellis, what did you do? Raymond shrugged. Gave her something she trusted. She was trying to run on a frequency that didn't match her memory. Now she's back in tune. Brannon looked at the panel, watching as system after system ticked green. Unbelievable, she muttered. One of the younger engineers, a smug-faced tech named Riley Brent, crossed his arms. This doesn't make sense. How do you know what to check? There's no way you just guessed that. Raymond turned to him. I didn't guess. I listened. Brent scoffed. It's a machine. You can't listen to metal and wires. Raymond took a step toward him, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance. His voice was low, even... You ever watch someone bleed out from a pressure burst because the cooling system failed at the wrong second? You ever crawl into a pipe chase with 40 seconds of oxygen left because a valve you knew was going to fail finally did? Brent said nothing. No. Then don't talk to me about what you can and can't listen to. The room stayed quiet. Ellis turned back to the engine and gave it a gentle knock. She's alive. Let her breathe. For the first time in nearly 4 days, the Halcyon hummed. Not weakly, not glitching, just steady, honest, real, and outside on the open sea. The ship began to move again, but the questions weren't over. Because once a ship like this fails once, command starts asking what else might break. The USS Halcyon didn't lurch forward. She didn't jolt or groan or make a dramatic noise when she came back online. She glided slow at first, barely noticeable movement. Beneath their boots? But it was enough. The engines had sunk, the propulsion interface was holding steady, and the AI had stopped throwing error codes inside the control room. Lieutenant Darby leaned forward in his seat, hands hovering over the console like he didn't trust what he was seeing. "Sir, we're moving," he said softly, not taking his eyes off the screen. Captain Brannon stood behind him, arms folded, jaw tight. "How fast? 0.8 knots? No drag? Power curves climbing back toward normal parameters. She's stabilizing."
"Hi, Commander."
Patel exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. She's back. Down in the engine room, the silence that followed the restart was filled with restrained disbelief. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then, as the systems reported green one after another, a slow ripple of claps started from Maurice. Then, Yuan, then even Patel Raymond Ellis didn't clap. He just watched the diagnostic panel until the final warning light disappeared. Then he closed his notebook. "I've seen worse," he muttered. Captain Brannon came down the ladder into the room, her eyes scanning every face before locking on Raymond. "You did something no one else could. We were almost ready to tug her back to shore." Raymond shook his head. "You'd have dragged back a dead machine. Might have looked good from the outside, but she'd never run right again." Brannon looked around at the crew, still trying to wrap their heads around what just happened. How'd we miss it? Every expert, every protocol. Ellis leaned against the wall, wiping his hands. "Because you stopped listening. These ships there, not just wires and code. They've got rhythm, history. Once something's out of tune, the system doesn't care how smart your AI is. It's still wrong." Brannon gave a slight nod. "That relay issue really saw it before?" USS Mathis, 2008. Prototype install. Same model, same echo loop. Hannah Yuen spoke up from the side, but the system specs were changed since then. Specs change, physics don't. Patel leaned in, watching Raymond closely. "No. You said earlier the system was scared, that it was defending itself. You meant that literally?" Raymond shrugged. "As literal as a machine can be. You give something enough inputs, it starts drawing its own conclusions. Your AI thought it was under attack, so it locked you out and kept you out." He tapped the notebook in his hand. "You keep building smarter systems. You better remember what they're built on. The bones matter." There was a pause. It wasn't awkward, just thoughtful. The kind that settles over a room when people realize they've been doing something wrong for longer than they want to admit. Brannon broke the silence. "You saved this ship. You saved all of us." Raymond didn't flinch at the praise. "I didn't save anyone. I just gave her a second chance." Patel stepped forward. "So what now? Do we need to rewrite the entire diagnostic protocol?" Raymond smiled, just barely. "Or you teach the next guy to use a stethoscope once in a while." Engineers laughed out mockingly, but with real relief. It wasn't just the restart. It was knowing the nightmare might finally be over. Raymond reached for the bundle he'd set aside earlier. The cloth that held the old wrench from his father. He tucked it into his jacket pocket. He wasn't going to stay long, he knew that. His job was never about staying. It was about getting the system moving again, then stepping aside. Captain Brannon walked with him as he headed back toward the deck. "You didn't have to come, you know," she said. "Could have said no. I almost did. So why didn't you?" Raymond paused at the door, looked back toward the engine room. "Because when a ship calls for help, someone should answer." But not. Everyone saw this as a win. Some back at command were already questioning how this failure happened at all. The answers weren't going to be comfortable. The Halcyon was moving again, but not everyone was celebrating. Hours after the restart, while the crew regained their rhythm and systems returned to full function, a different kind of tension began to take shape. Not technical, political. Back at Naval Base Point Loma, reports had already been filed. Senior officers began asking uncomfortable questions. Why did one of the Navy's most advanced destroyers go down during a controlled training exercise? Why did the failure go undetected by diagnostic AI? Why did it take a retired chief with no clearance and no current credentials to fix a multi-billion-dollar ship? To maybe most pressing of all, who was responsible? Captain Brannon had already received 2 encrypted messages marked urgent review. They weren't congratulating her. They were asking for explanations. Down on the lower deck, in a smaller briefing room with coffee-stained chairs and buzzing overhead lights, A private meeting had been called. Commander Raj Patel, Lieutenant Neil Darby, Civilian Systems Engineer Hannah Yuan, and Raymond Ellis. Darby leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. I'm just saying we all need to be aligned before this goes upstairs. Aligned, Ellis repeated, not looking up from his notebook. Darby shifted. There's already chatter about protocol violations, pulling hardware from comms, bypassing standard procedures, no documentation. If someone decides this was a liability instead of a fix, we're the ones on the line. Ewan spoke up. He's right. Even though it worked, technically everything we did could be flagged. Ellis isn't even under contract. This whole thing could get spun wrong. Raymond closed the notebook and set it on the table. You know what gets people hurt? He asked, his voice calm, worrying more about paperwork than problems. Patel rubbed his temples. He's got a point, but we're not debating whether it worked. We're debating how to protect it from being used against us. Raymond leaned back. I didn't ask to be flown out here. I didn't beg for a second shot at some Navy hero send-off. I came because a ship was asking for help. If the folks in the suits don't like how I fixed it, that's not my problem. Darby shook his head. With respect, sir, I told you not to call me that. A beat of silence, then Patel broke in. Let's be honest. If we file a full incident report, you'll probably never be invited back to touch another Navy ship. Hell. They'll probably start rewriting protocols just to make sure nobody ever calls in another outsider. Raymond nodded slowly. Maybe that's the lesson they want. He stood up not in anger, but something else. It's fatigue. Not physical. Deeper. I've been fixing ships longer than some of you have been alive. I've crawled through fire suppression. Failures, chewed through carbon buildup with a butter knife, and repaired cooling lines while a ship listed 20 degrees to port in the middle of a storm. You know what I never needed? A permission slip. Nobody said a word outside the room. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Captain Brannon entered, holding a tablet. They want me on a secure line in 10, she said. They're already spinning this as a systems anomaly. Some of the upper brass are trying to downplay the issue entirely. Raymond raised an eyebrow. Of course they are. Brannon looked at him carefully. They're also asking how an uncredentialed civilian was allowed access to the propulsion core. Raymond gave a tired smile. Tell them I brought donuts. She almost smiled back. Almost. He stepped closer. You want the truth in your report. Say the ship was down. Say every expert failed. Just failed. And say an old man walked on, listened, and fixed. It because that's what happened. Don't lie to protect me. Don't lie to protect them. Tell the truth. Let them choke on it if they have to. Brannon nodded. You'll be off the ship within the hour. Transport's already inbound. Raymond didn't argue. He just glanced once more toward the direction of the engine room. The hum was steady now, of the ship. Was breathing? He turned back. She's strong again. That's all I care about. But before Raymond left, someone unexpected stopped him with a question that would change how he viewed what he'd just done. Raymond was halfway to the landing pad when he heard the voice. Mr. Ellis, wait. He turned to see Petty Officer D'Angelo Morris jogging toward him, a bit out of breath, holding something in his hands. Raymond slowed. What is it? Morris stopped just short of him and held up the worn notebook. We left this in the briefing. Raymond took it, gave it a quick glance, and slipped it under his arm. Appreciate it. Maurice didn't move. There was a hesitation in his face, like he wanted to ask something but wasn't sure if he had the right. You all right? Raymond asked. Morris nodded slowly, then blurted out, how did you know? Not just the part. About the capacitor, but the way the whole system would respond. None of that's in any of our training. Raymond looked him in the eye. Because you can't program instinct. He waited to see if Morris understood. The young sailor's brow furrowed, and Raymond softened his tone. You've been taught how the systems should work. That's good. But you also got to learn what they do when they don't. Machines don't always follow instructions. Sometimes they react. Sometimes they hide what's broken. You've got to learn their habits, not just their blueprints. Morris listened like he was hearing something no one had told him before. Do you think I could learn that? He asked. Raymond paused. That kind of question didn't come easy for most men, Especially not on a warship. Especially not to someone. They barely knew you just did, Raymond said. You watched me listen instead of guess. You paid attention. Next time something breaks, do the same. Get quiet. Don't rush. Let the machine tell you what's wrong. Maurice nodded, almost reverently. Thank you, Sir Raymond. Raymond clapped him gently on the shoulder. Keep asking the hard questions, even when you think you're not supposed to. A few minutes later, Raymond stood by the open door of the transport chopper. Captain Brandon approached. No formalities this time. She looked different, less rigid, more human. I've been thinking about what you said, she began. Which part? He asked, half smiling. The part about listening. I've spent so much time trusting screens, readouts, reports. I forgot what it meant to actually listen to what's real. Raymond nodded. It's easy to forget. You're surrounded by people telling you the ship's fine, the numbers are right. But ships lie sometimes, just like people. She looked out toward the ocean. What happens to all of that when people like you stop showing up? Raymond thought about that. Really thought about it. He hoped somebody else remembers. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even next month. But eventually someone finds your notebook. Or they asked the right question at the wrong time. Or they screw something up so badly, they have to do what I did, go back to the beginning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old wrench. He handed it to her without a word. Brandon hesitated. I can't take that. It's not for you, Raymond said. It's for the next sailor who thinks they're too young to be right and too old to still be learning. Keep it somewhere no one touches. Just don't forget where it came from. She held the wrench like it was something sacred. The chopper's blade started turning. Raymond climbed in, then turned one last time. Got a good ship, Captain. She's just not as shiny as she wants to be. Brandon smiled. Neither are most of us. The transport lifted off, sending sea spray across the deck. Raymond didn't look down. He didn't need to. The ship was fixed. The story would either be buried in paperwork or whispered down hallways, but the Halcyon would keep going. That was enough. In his lap, the notebook stayed closed, but his mind wasn't. Because the truth was, he wasn't just fixing engines. He was leaving behind a different kind of map, one written in mistakes, corrections, quiet decisions, and unspoken rules. But back home in Norfolk, something was already waiting that would remind Raymond his work wasn't finished. Not yet, too. Days later, Raymond Ellis was back in Norfolk's steam garage. Same tools, same rusted fan, pushing warm air across the room like it was trying to quit. He was elbow deep in the guts of an old Evinrude engine, sleeves rolled, radio murmuring low in the background. It was like he'd never left, except something had changed. The call came mid-morning. Not from Pike, not from the Navy, from someone else entirely. Mr. Ellis, this is Commander Leanne Cho. I'm heading up a training revision task force at the Naval Engineering School in Gulfport. Your name's been surfacing. Raymond wiped his hands, sat down on the nearest stool, and waited. I'm not recruiting, she said quickly. I know you're done. I heard what you did on the Halcyon. I was hoping you'd be willing to talk to some of our trainees. Informally, not a lecture, just a conversation about what doesn't make it into manuals. Raymond didn't respond right away. Commander Cho filled the silence. We've got smart kids, but they're being trained by systems that assume they'll never need to go off script. The ship will tell them everything. But sometimes it lies. I think you might be the only one left who knows what that looks like. He leaned back, looking at the ceiling of his garage. One of the tiles was stained brown from an old leak that had never been fixed. What had been there? For years, he used to find it ugly. Now, it just looked honest. I'll think about it, he said finally. She didn't push. That's all I ask. After they hung up, Raymond stood in the doorway, looking out over the street. A city bus passed. A kid on a bike weaved between parked cars. Normal life. And yet, in the back of his mind, the Halcyon was still there, humming. That afternoon, he did something he hadn't done in years. Took out a clean notebook, blank pages. No stains, no bent corners, sand at the top of the first page. He wrote, things the ship won't tell you. Below that, he began listing them. Not technical. Specs, not procedures. Just truths. The sound of a relay right before it dies isn't sharp. It's sluggish. If a pump surges 3 times in 10 seconds, shut it down. The fourth surge means someone gets hurt. Don't trust a screen until you've touched the wire behind it. If the ship feels different, it probably is. By the end of the day, 5 pages were filled not with instruction, but with memory. The next morning, a package arrived. No return address. Inside a photo. The engine room of the Halcyon post repair. On the wall, mounted in a shadow box, was the old wrench. A plaque underneath read, "This tool once stopped a warship from going silent." Raymond smiled. Later that week, he agreed to meet Commander Cho's trainees. It's not at a podium in the corner of a hangar, folding chairs in a loose circle. He didn't bring slides or charts, just that notebook and the same tired hands that still knew how to listen. One of the young trainees asked, "What's the most important thing you ever fixed?" Raymond paused. He could have said the Halcyon, or the blackout in Barren, or that emergency bypass he built from scavenged parts in '97. But instead, he said, "My patience." The room went quiet. Not from confusion, but understanding. "You'll panic one day," he told them. "You'll hear a sound you don't recognize, and the ship will stop responding. Everyone will look at you, not the computer, not the manual, just you. And if you let the panic talk first, you'll miss what the machine's really saying." He closed the notebook and tapped it gently. The good ones? They listen twice before they touch anything. The trainees nodded slowly, eyes locked on him like every word was a rope they wanted to hold on to. When the session ended, one of them, a young woman with grease still on her coveralls, waited until the others left. She asked, "Do you think machines remember us?" Raymond chuckled. "Maybe, but the better question is, will you remember them?" He left her with the notebook, not the new one, the original. Yellowed, wrinkled, full of smudged ink and fingerprints. "From decades of work. Copy what you want," he said, "but only if you plan to add to it." That night, back in Norfolk, Raymond sat in his chair with the radio low and the wrench now missing from its usual spot. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt useful again, because sometimes what we leave behind isn't just tools or notes. It's the habit of listening when no one else does. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone who's forgotten the value of experience. And if you ever feel like your time has passed, remember, the next generation might still be waiting for your voice. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of what truly matters.